Hello everyone and welcome to the very last week of our semester. It's difficult to believe that we've already reached the end. Today we'll actually be discussing the end of the Medici dynasty and Tuscany's transition to foreign rule by the Habsburg-Lorraine branch of the Habsburg family. After examining some of the elements that contributed to the downfall of the Medici, we'll then take a look back at some of the major events and personalities that we have studied over the course of the semester. We find ourselves at this point now in the early decades of the 18th century. Last week we discussed a bit about the intellectual and artistic climate of Florence and Tuscany in this period, under the reign of Cosimo III. Cosimo III had two sons that were directly in line for the eventual dukedom, one of whom was Gian Gastone, and Gian Gastone would unexpectedly become the Grand Duke, unexpectedly because he had an older brother who was, however, a roving philanderer and contracted syphilis, which was also known as the French pox. Syphilis rotted away his brain and much of his body, and he eventually died from it, leaving Gian Gastone to assume the reins of rulership. Unfortunately, Gian Gastone was particularly ill-suited to this post. He was very introverted. He was very shy. He had very bad manners. He was garrulous. But aside from these sort of personal limitations, he also had what we would now likely diagnose as acute depressive disorder. He was also homosexual, and he was forced into a very unhappy relationship and eventual marriage with Anna Maria Franziska of Saxe-Lauenburg. It's a relationship that was arranged by his sister, and it was really beyond a difficult relationship. They moved back and forth between his realm and hers. For a time, he spent a period in Prague as well. But Anna Maria was absolutely disgusted with him, and she also claimed that he was impotent. As it turns out, he wasn't impotent, but he just wasn't interested in her. So they had this very difficult relationship, which again was not made any more easy by Gian Gastone's very kind of melancholy demeanor. Gian Gastone was raised more or less by his grandmother, Vittoria del Rovere. Fortunately, though, he was not cut from the same mold as his father or his brother before him. And in fact, he had a very difficult relationship with his father, Cosimo III. Partially this stemmed from the fact that he was kept on a very strict allowance, so that he was not able to live in the style that one would expect of a Medici prince. But it was also the fact that they were just very intellectually very different men. Gian Gastone was very dedicated to his studies and to his tutor, the Cardinal Henry Norris. But he was also, more than that, he was an intellectual, he was an antiquarian, and he was a natural philosopher. Now, these are all things that his father very much was not. His father was very close-minded, repressive, biased, and he also persecuted the Jews within Tuscany, and he issued laws against the teaching of Galileo Galilei's principles. In general, Cosimo is, to some extent, responsible for the kind of decadence of intellectual inquiry in Tuscany in the late 17th and early 18th century. But Gian Gastone, when he was unexpectedly thrust into the limelight, resolved to reverse the situation. He was a very cosmopolitan man as well, so he was a speaker of many languages, among which being English, which is becoming more and more well known as a language. Generally, in the course of the 17th century, it's still a language that is not spoken by anyone of any repute. English voyagers were often also able to speak French or certainly Latin for those of them who are more scholarly minded. But English only becomes spoken as a second or a third language really into the middle of this 18th century. But it shows that in some ways John Gastone was a sort of questing man, at least intellectually. And this also bears witness in his reforms of Tuscany. Essentially, he goes about reversing all of his father's policies. He repudiates taxes on the poorest of the inhabitants in Tuscany. He also repealed the penal laws, which restricted Jews, and he stopped all public executions. Now, this is a really notable concept because the idea of public punishment, of a public execution, is a tool of the state. For those of you who read Foucault, Michel Foucault, it's sort of the beginning, really, of the state intrusiveness into the individual and into the minds, the hearts and minds, essentially, of normal people. And one of these tools of the state is to use these public executions and really public tortures. So while you have very bloody, brutal executions going on in France all the way up to the Revolution, and when the revolutionaries, in the form of the guillotine, appropriate that power of the state to condemn, to torture, and to execute and make it their own, using a device, by the way, which was invented by guillotine to actually make executions more humane, rather than chopping off their heads with axes or swords or hanging them by the neck. They appropriated, the French revolutionaries appropriated the tools of the state to against it, essentially, and to legitimate their own rule. But back to Tuscany. So in an era in which public executions are becoming even really the strong arm of the state, John Gastone repudiates all this as no, that we don't want public executions anymore. He doesn't stop corporal punishment entirely. That would be left up to one of his successors, who I will get to in a moment. But he does stop the public executions. The problem with this entire situation is that John Gastone has absolutely no interest in his wife, and thus no interest really in legitimate procreation. This prompts what was known as the Tuscany problem, or the problem of Tuscany, which was the problem of succession. And essentially you have a number of great powers all claiming the throne in Tuscany. And why are they all getting involved? Well, because a number of them have blood ties, direct blood ties to Tuscany. The Medici, as we recall, for over a good century, were intermarrying with some of Europe's most foremost aristocrats. And it was also further complicated by the fact that, as we recall from 2 weeks ago, Tuscany had to play a delicate balancing act with a number of treaties with other foreign potentates. Therefore, this becomes a very pressing issue to a number of foreign powers, such as Spain and Austria and the Dutch Republic. And what ends up happening is that through a number of negotiations during a period, again, of ongoing large-scale warfare, Spain and Great Britain and Austria and the Dutch Republic agree on Charles of Spain essentially being invested with the dukedom. Now, this is later transferred to Francis Stephen of Lorraine in part of a peace deal that was finalized in 1738. And Francis Lorraine then came to the throne when John Gastone died in 1737. The problem, of course, was that John Gastone ended up hanging on for quite a long time, despite his very deteriorating health and unusual mental state. He spent the last 10 years of his life completely bedridden, and not because of any sort of ailment that robbed him of his ability to be ambulatory, but because he was so reportedly depressed that he would never leave his chambers. He used to spend days on end sort of weeping uncontrollably in his bedroom. And aside from that, he also became incredibly reclusive and devoted to his personal lackeys and to his troupe of male performers and entertainers, you might say, called the Ruspanti. And the Ruspanti were a troupe or a sort of harem, again, of very young men, very poor, but also very handsome, who were assembled by one of the Grand Duke's lackeys to essentially provide sexual pleasure for the Grand Duke. And this, of course, doesn't serve to help his reputation any. The Grand Duke, at the same time, had come to hate the entire aristocratic system and the nobles so much that he never came out of his chambers. He never really showed up at balls or any of the usual activities that an aristocrat would be involved in at that level. And he actually nicknamed all of his Ruspanti, the members of this male harem, by the names of prominent Tuscan noblemen. So it was essentially the ultimate tongue-in-cheek, or not even tongue-in-cheek, very overt shirking of his responsibilities as a Grand Duke, and also essentially castigating the entire system, which he no longer had any interest in. Gian Gastone, however eccentric his personality, did, however, leave the dukedom of Tuscany on the right sort of path to the Enlightenment in general, if we think about the other kind of reforms that are taking place across Europe in this period. Essentially, one of the most essential things that he was able to do, aside from the reforms, which of course were very important, was to make sure that his sister, who he knew would not be allowed to take over reign of the dukedom after he expired, but he was able at least to secure that an agreement that she would have complete control over all the Medici property. Now, this is crucial because we're not just speaking about property in the sense of palaces out in the countryside or palazzi in the center of Florence, which certainly the Medici did have, but really about all that artwork that the Medici had been collecting for over 300 years. Now, this is why if you go to the Uffizi now, you're able to see so many masterpieces assembled in the same place. And it's a little bit like the Johann Zoffany painting, a portrait that we looked at last week. We can thank Gian Gastone and his sister who followed him, not as the Grand Duchess, but still in a position of power, that they were able to preserve their vast collection of artwork. And in fact, when the Grand Duchess, for lack of a better term, expired, she also donated all of her works to the Tuscan people with the explicit requirement that none of those works ever leave the dominion of Tuscany. So again, however eccentric these last, and eccentric, gouty, fat, torpid, all the other kind of very vivid adjectives that we can think of for them. Despite all of that, they did leave behind a legacy of better human rights and great masterpieces of art. So we can thank them for that.